Used it. Oh, there we go. Live stream is going now. And I didn't do anything. So, Jonathan?
I just tried it again and it worked.
Yep. Used it. Okay. There we go. Live stream is going now. And I didn't do anything. So, somebody's got their live stream.
I just tried it again and it worked.
Yep. Used it. Okay. There we go. Live stream is going now. And I didn't do anything. Somebody's got their live stream.
I just tried it again and it worked.
Yep. Used it. Okay. There we go. Live stream is going now. And I didn't do anything. Okay. Somebody's got
again and it worked.
Are we good now? I think as Jonathan had his speaker on. Okay. So back to our exciting meeting. Also, everybody should have received something from Apple pertaining to accepting the new cloud terms of service. So I want to know if anybody read those and anybody give us a succinct, what did they do? What did they say? What do they mean? I know it's probably all for the security updates and everything like that, but I'm just a jump in the Apple water and swim. So whatever they said they were going to do for the cloud for me, I took. So, but you probably should have seen those terms. So,
should we go to Rich McKinney, who had questions in the chat? And Roy, I want to let you know that wonderfully, one of our scholarship recipients from Mason has attended the meeting. Archange, thanks so much for coming today. And so when a time comes, let's actually recognize him to talk about what he's up to these days.
Okay. Go ahead to Rich.
Hi, good morning. Can you hear me?
Yes.
So yeah, my chat. I couldn't get my iPad. What?
Who has?
Is that feedback from somewhere? Is that me?
No, I just muted Joe.
Okay, there we go.
Wanted to do a third screen.
So I couldn't join my iPad, and I got that message that I typed in the chat. Your Wi-Fi, your network is operating on Wi-Fi channels and used by several other nearby networks. I couldn't figure out what's going on. It interrupted my laptop, which is like 2 feet from my modem. I have an Eero. But you know how I solved it finally is I have 2 extenders on my mesh network. I unplugged one of them and the problem went away.
Does Joe have a comment about this?
Back to the HomePod and everything. I just thought I would mention, I learned yesterday, having burned out one of my Philips Hue bulbs, that Philips has finally come out with some brighter bulbs than their original ones. For like 4 or 5 years, all they had was a 60-watt equivalent, and now they've got a 75 and 100-watt equivalent bulb. Wow. which is good for me because in my living room I need a little bit more light. So that may not be exciting to anybody else, but I was excited by it.
Well, that is good to know if you need more light, because yeah, some of those are pretty dim if you try to use them. So anybody have any more comments about the resetting of the router and restarting?
Rich, is the Eero should be smart enough that devices go seamlessly between the different nodes.
It did on all my other devices. It was just on this one iPad. And it all started when Xfinity updated software to my Motorola router, the MB8611. And I went online and many people have had the same issue on the router, but they just say restart it, turn it off, blah, blah, blah. And after about a week and a half of this, I did something and the router stabilized, but it wasn't until I unplugged one of my mesh extenders that the problem went away.
So sorry, Rich, does the cable modem actually also broadcast Wi-Fi?
It's not no, it's not a combi, no.
So the Wi-Fi isn't coming from that.
Correct. It's all out of the E-row.
Okay.
Okay, Joe, do you have any comment about this, or is your hand still just up?
Sorry, that was persistence of hand.
Oh, okay. I guess then we'll go on to Diana and check out what she has to say.
Yeah, oh, we've been having some trouble with our Wi-Fi connectivity, and I wasn't going to pester you guys with this, but since you're talking about that kind of thing anyway, I'll throw it out. I don't have any Apple HomePods or other nodes. We have a Cox modem bringing in the signal from outside, and then we have a Linksys router, which I used to replace my old Apple whatchamacallit, tower Wi-Fi. And my son has downstairs another router of a different brand. Let me think. We've been having intermittent connection problems on Wi-Fi, and they come and go. It just happened a little while ago. I was connected to my bank, no problem, on my iMac. He comes upstairs and says, I have no connection downstairs. He's got a PC, and we have a smart TV, and he's got his phone, his iPhone, and he had lost the signal, and I was fine, it seemed. And then I picked up my phone and tried it, and it had lost the signal. And this keeps happening intermittently, and we don't know how to diagnose it and how to figure out what's going on, whether it's a problem with the Cox signal coming in the neighborhood, or whether it's some conflict between the various pieces of equipment we have inside. And I'm at a loss. I'm not a terminal person. I can't, type in commands and analyze a network that way. Does anybody have any thoughts about what could be happening?
Bill? Or, well, let's see.
Yeah, no idea what's happening with Diana, but I had an intermittent internet connection issue for the last couple of weeks. And first, I'm with Xfinity and have the Black Tower modem. I think it's called Gateway. The first technician who came out, trying to remember what he did. He put a booster in, and when he left, the signal was fine. By the end of the day, it had dropped out again. The next technician who came replaced the modem, and it was working when he left, and then dropped out by the end of the day. The third technician came and replaced the wire from the pole outside my house to the house. When he left, it was working, and then it dropped out. The fourth technician came, and I have a signal that comes into, the wire comes into one end of the house, into the basement. It goes back outside the house, up through the attic, and drops down into a room on the far side of the house. So we bypassed that and put a second new modem closer to the original signal, and it's working fine now. So my suspicion is that a mouse or some critter may have chewed or done something with that wire that goes through the attic.
Squirrels, probably
Right.
squirrels, right?
Yeah.
Now, well,
Now, more
it sounds like
more
I need
likely
to
a
contact
mouse.
Cox and jerk on them, and
Yeah,
if they have a solution. I don't know, maybe it's not us inside the house. I mean, the modem that we have from Cox is relatively new. It was replaced last year simply because of the age of the old one. And I must say that it has not been as reliable as the old one in many ways. Not that the old one was perfect.
Dan, did you say you had
Okay.
multiple Wi-Fi routers?
Yeah, we have two because we had the one downstairs. We've had that for a while. And then my Apple airport just seemed to be getting old, and
Yeah,
so I replaced that with a newer what they had at the Apple store was a Linksys. And that was not long ago, 6 months ago, that we
Yes, but
did that.
The trouble is, if you have multiple Wi-Fi routers, they could be conflicting on the same channel. Wi-Fi goes across several channels. If you have
Right.
different routers from two different manufacturers, they may not know how to share space, and they may be trying to talk on the same channels. It's sort of like us on this Zoom call. If I'm trying to talk at the same time somebody else is trying to talk, you don't necessarily hear what's going on. And you might be better off just getting one good router and just using that than trying to run two.
Well, I'm a little skeptical with even though we moved the router to a more central location, I'm a little skeptical that it would manage both upstairs and downstairs from one. So I don't know. But I'll think about that. I mean, I wondered if there could be some kind of conflict between them.
There is a way to set the routers to use different channels, but unfortunately, that's usually not something that's obvious. You have to go in usually with terminal and tell it to do that. But it's fairly common especially if they're from different manufacturers, that the way that they choose to switch channels, it doesn't keep them from having conflicts. The nice thing about the Apple airports is the airports would detect what channel they were on, and they wouldn't do that. But most routers don't do that.
Well, I wish that they would upgrade the airports and still make them, but they don't, so we're having to deal with getting a different type. And the Linksys, as I say, was what was selling in the Apple store. So that's what I bought.
Yeah, the guy who designed the airports for Apple, he founded a new company called Ubiquiti, which is U-B-I-T, it's spelled strange. And
what was the name?
Ubiquiti. The good news, bad news is that they're really, really good equipment. The bad news is that they're a little bit on the complicated, but several people in the Pi have them. They're called Dream Machines. And if you just set up in their basic configuration, they work fairly well. They're not cheap though.
Lawrence, can you put that in chat?
Okay.
Okay.
Okay, thanks for the suggestions, guys.
All right. Do we have any more router or
Roy, maybe
Yes.
could we perhaps recognize the scholarship recipient too?
Yes, let's do that. I was just wanting to if anybody had any more comments, we can go to that afterward. Yes. Go ahead, Jonathan.
Arcane Justang is one of our last year's GMU scholarship recipients. Arcane, so nice of you to come to the meeting today. Do you want to just speak for a couple of minutes and tell us how your program is going and what you're working on?
Sorry, thank you very much. I think it's a nice meeting, although it's about the issues. I hope they will be solved very soon. Again, thank you for having me. I've been recipient last year, November 21, if I remember. And since now, I've been doing progress with the PhD study, mostly the coursework. And I'm advancing to the active research now about AI, natural language processing. Okay, because deep learning is kind of very common now, but they lack of interpretation, right? How to understand what deep learning is doing, why there is mistakes. So we are trying to do explainable AI, trying to have agents that can explain the outcomes, not just pushing outcome out. Okay, so I haven't started research, but I'm about to start doing the research. Also, I am the vice president of the Computer Science Student Association. I might send the link later because we believe that we can help students to have better life, and because also better life means better research also. And also, yeah, basically it also this term I'm teaching instructor of one of the courses in undergrad. It's kind of a large class, 100 students, but it's kind of interesting experience to do also.
Thank you so much. Folks, does anyone have any questions for Archange?
Do you have an additional comment, or Lawrence, or is your hand just left up?
Oh, I'm sorry.
Diane, go ahead.
Did you say that you teach 100 students in some undergrad class?
Yeah, I think it's not it's 96. 96 students. I just want to go. Yeah, but this one 96 students for the undergrad class, CS 211.
And what are you teaching that there would be?
I'm teaching object-oriented programming with Java.
Say that again, please.
I'm teaching object-oriented programming using Java.
So are these freshmen students
Mhm.
that are in the class?
Yes.
Very interesting.
Yeah, it's interesting.
Right. Any other questions? Yes, it's always interesting to know what our different scholarship winners are working on and doing in the current state of computer systems. So.
And Archange, we still haven't actually been able to synchronize to have you actually come to one of our Pi meetings at Mason. So hopefully one of these days we'll have a hybrid meeting back at Mason, and it would be wonderful to actually meet you in person.
Yeah, I would be happy to meet you in person too. Although I might need to have the announcement like earlier. For example, for today's meeting, I have it at 8 in the morning. Maybe my email is not working correctly. Yeah, but if I know it ahead of time, I would be happy to participate.
That'd be great. And do you have a question? Anne, are you there? I'll unmute you, Anne. There.
Go ahead, Anne.
Oh, maybe she's not there. Okay. Anyone else have any questions? Comments on the topic? Okay. Jonathan?
Yes, thanks, Roy. We are delighted to have at our Pi meeting today, Shira Ovidi, who is an amazing thinker about consumer tech. She most recently had written tech columns at the New York Times, but all to our advantage, moved to the Washington Post, even though she still lives in Queens, where she writes, "I am your tech friend." And can someone put a link in the chat to Shira's column, as we've done before, because these are bi-weekly, and they are to a T always very thoughtful about, from the consumer perspective, issues around tech. Thanks so much, Shira. Anyway, why don't we now turn the floor over to Shira Ovidi?
Thank you so much, everybody. Good morning. Thank you for inviting me into your Zoom rooms. Still a strange format, even though we've been doing this for 3 years. And Jonathan, can you just remind me, so I don't blather on, about how much time I should talk, and then give a chance for folks to ask questions as well?
Yeah, I would say maybe 30, 45 minutes if that
Sounds good.
works for you.
That sounds fine.
And if I can say, folks, while Shira is actually presenting her material, put your questions in the chat. So then when she comes to a stopping point, we'll be able to address those.
Great. And I'm going to share my screen, and I never remember how to do this. So just so you know, even the tech reporter is not smart about screen share. Sorry. Oh no.
It is often a challenge.
Can somebody remind me how to do this?
Yeah, click on share screen, and then in the pop-up, you'll want to choose the desktop and choose the desktop that has your.
Okay, very good. Thank you. Okay, can folks see this now? Nope, you're still
No.
seeing me, huh? Hold on.
There we go.
Okay, success.
Yes.
All right. So hopefully, Jonathan, you got a sense of what I'd be speaking about today. So I write about many, many things, but I have chosen to speak to you about a topic that I find both personally and professionally interesting, which is technology and transportation. And let me just take a minute to tell you a little bit about myself, who I am. I've been a journalist for about 20 years. About 15 of those years, I've written about technology and tech companies at the Wall Street Journal, Bloomberg News, the New York Times, as Jonathan said, and now at the Washington Post. And just one more plug for the newsletter that I write, which publishes Tuesdays and Fridays. It is called The Tech Friend. And there's another link. So just so my bosses know that I'm doing all the promotions I can. And I also, since this is Apple Pie, I wanted to talk a little bit about my personal history with technology. So I had a little debate with my family when I was preparing this talk about what was our first family computer. And I think we have landed on this, the Macintosh LC from the very early 90s, this gorgeous beige box. That was our first family computer, we're pretty sure. And because it was the 90s, I spent a lot of time using America Online on that computer. I still hear that noise of dial-up internet in my head sometimes late at night. And again, when I went to college, this beautiful machine, the Macintosh PowerBook 150, that was the computer that I took to college. And I have memories of cleaning lint and other materials out of the trackball. I believe this was the last model that Apple made with this trackball instead of a trackpad, and it definitely got gummed up with lint and crumbs and things like that. And because this was the mid-90s, my college career, my time in college, was also the moment when web browsers, when Netscape first came out, it was really the rise of the web. And my professional career has also intersected with sort of the smartphone age. So I can sort of mark 3 transitions of computing, you know, the personal computer age, the internet, the web age, web browser age, and now the smartphone age, can mark those periods as sort of different phases of my personal life and professional life. So let me tell you why I've chosen this particular topic, tech and transportation, to talk to you about. And again, this is a subject that is interesting to me both personally and professionally. So I'm interested in transportation because I think that our roads and our sidewalks are one of the few shared spaces in our lives where we regularly interact with strangers, with one another. We come into contact all the time, for better, for worse, and we're responsible for one another. And we have to sort of figure out ways to share this space that we take part in together. It's sort of this grand social experiment on our roads and sidewalks. And it is also one example of a shared public good, an expensive shared public good that we all pay for and share. And it is one of the visible manifestations of how government does or does not work, right? When we see a pothole, when we drive over that same pothole every day, that is sort of a daily reminder, essentially, of a government failure, right? And I will talk more about this as I progress, but sort of the more research I've done about transportation, about the role of technology in transportation over the decades, the more convinced I am that the way we currently move people and goods in the United States requires fundamental rethinking. It is dangerous. It gobbles up public space and government dollars. It's environmentally unsustainable. And it is a goal of my both personal and professional life to sort of try to better understand how technology can help or not with this, important social, political, and economic question of how do we move people and goods around differently in a way that solves some of the problems of the status quo, and how do we get there? Because I think by all accounts, it will be difficult to change our current transportation status quo. So I want to start by talking about three fundamental flaws with the way we move around people and goods, particularly in the United States. And the three main problems that technology or policy hopes to solve are road safety, climate change, and pollution and traffic. So I want to kind of zero in on those three fundamental problems, and then I'll move on to talking about solutions and where tech may play a role or areas where it may not. So the first problem is road safety. And I apologize, this is not a great chart, particularly if you're on a small screen, but what it shows with that big arrow, if you can see that, this is a ranking of per capita road deaths, deaths from vehicular crashes in 36 or so fairly affluent countries. And this is organized per capita, so it's adjusted for population. And you can see here that the United States is second worst among these relatively affluent countries in the number of road deaths per capita. And just for a sense of scope, right? Our road deaths in the United States per capita, it's sort of 3 times higher than Spain, than Japan, than Germany, other countries that are sort of relatively affluent and developed. This is and just to show you how that number has trended over time in the United States compared to other countries. This again is from the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, as was the previous chart. And it shows that since 2010, ending in 2020, the overall annual road deaths collectively in these countries declined by 1/3. In the 10-year period that was studied. And the United States, we've essentially done the opposite, that apart from some periods of stasis or decline in road deaths have now sort of increased. We recently hit a 16-year high in traffic deaths in the United States. And just for context, we're still crunching data on 2022, but it looks like about 40,000 Americans died last year on American roads. And just for context, that's about double the number of Americans who died in gun homicides. So, this is a problem, a daily problem in the United States, and a public health crisis, if you want to think about it that way. And again, these are just some headlines from various publications about, again, this kind of American exceptionalism of road deaths that are both high and getting worse over time, while other countries are getting better. And let me just take a minute to talk about why American roads are uniquely dangerous and getting worse. We drive more. I think that is something we can intuitively understand. And obviously, the more you drive, the more opportunities there are for road crashes and injuries and deaths. I will just point out here that Canada is another country that is big and people drive a lot. but the likelihood of a Canadian dying in a car crash is about 60% lower than it is for those of us in the United States. So again, the geography of the United States explains some of this high incidence of road deaths in the United States, but it doesn't explain everything. We tend to drive larger, heavier cars than our counterparts in other countries. Again, we can understand the basic physics of if you're driving a bigger, heavier car and you run into another car, a fixed object, a person, it's likely to do more damage than if you're driving a smaller car. Our roads are built for speed. We generally design roads in the United States to move vehicles quickly. And again, basic physics, the higher the speed, the more likelihood there is for crashes and for those crashes to have deleterious effects. And frankly, other countries simply chose different policies over the past 10 or 15 years than we did. The United States has relatively low rates of public transit use compared to other countries. Public transit is statistically safer than individuals driving their own cars. The United States has relatively uneven rule enforcement of traffic rules, even if you adjust for other differences among countries. And I'll just point out that some of the factors that people frequently cite about road crashes, things like distraction from smartphones or drunk driving or COVID making people kind of extra aggressive or crazy. I'll just point out that those factors mostly exist in other countries as well. So they don't, while they may obviously be certainly a factor in some road accidents, they don't really explain why America has a much higher rate of road deaths than our counterparts in other countries, and why it has gotten worse while in other countries road deaths have declined. So, okay, we talked about problem one with the transportation status quo. Let me just move on to sort of pollution and climate change. Again, this is a chart from the EPA. They apparently love blue in their charts. I'm sorry about that. It's not super clear. But what this chart shows is that in 2020, which is the latest data available, transportation was the #1 contributor to planet warming emissions. And it's second to electric power, which is, kind of somewhere just behind transportation. And by transportation, that is generally the majority of that is from cars and trucks, both privately owned cars and trucks and kind of commercial cars and trucks. And then the rest is kind of planes, boats, trains, things like that. And again, this is not just a kind of a climate or social issue of the emissions from cars and trucks and other transportation. It's also takes a toll on our individual health, that there are researched associations between the emissions of cars and trucks and increased rates of childhood asthma, increased rates of dementia, and increased rates of heart disease and strokes and other cardiovascular disease. So again, this takes a social toll and both an individual toll of the transportation system as it exists today. And the third problem, which I think we encounter every day, is traffic congestion, which is both individually annoying and takes we pay an economic price when it is slower to move around people or goods that we buy. And this is data from INRIX, which is a commercial company that provides traffic data. And you can see that on this top 10 list or worst 10 list of the most congested cities in North America, kind of, we do more than our fair share of traffic congestion, with the top or the worst US city being Chicago. And in case you're wondering, I looked it up. Washington, DC was 20th on this list. So not the worst, but also not great. Okay, so those are the three basic problems that I've highlighted with the transportation status quo, sort of our uniquely American problem of road safety, an unfortunately global problem of climate change and pollution, caused at least partly by cars and trucks moving around people and goods, and then traffic congestion. So let's talk a little bit about the solutions or the potential solutions. And, I want to be clear that systemic change is difficult, right? So changing the transportation status quo as it has existed in the United States, more or less in the decades since World War II, it's going to be really hard to change. But I think we can see from the problems that I highlighted that maintaining the status quo is also hard, right? And it also we pay a price for that. So I just want to focus first on electric cars because they get a lot of attention, and frankly, they should get a lot of attention. This is a headline from two of my former colleagues at Bloomberg, Liam Denning and Elaine Hay, from 2021, and I'm happy to send around the link to their column, but it essentially does some very clever numerical analysis and data crunching, and finds essentially, I've just pulled one quote from their piece, that electrifying US vehicles wipes out the equivalent of our entire current power demand. And what that's saying essentially is that because the internal combustion engine in most cars and trucks in the world, because that technology is so inefficient that most of the energy that we put into our cars and trucks is lost in the form of heat, rather than energy to move the wheels and propel our vehicles. Because most of that energy is lost to heat, because electric vehicles are so much more efficient in converting energy into power to turn the wheels, it is such a huge transformation, particularly to climate change and pollution, if we electrify vehicles. And the conclusion from their article, their column, is that moving electric vehicles, even if we do nothing else, may be the single biggest impact we can make on slowing climate change and cutting pollution. So even if again, the current status quo, we generate a lot of electric power from fossil fuel sources, including natural gas and coal and other climate harming sources. Even if we generate energy from fossil fuels, the impact of putting that electricity into an electric vehicle compared to a gas-powered vehicle, it is a transformative difference on our planet. And look, I know this transition is very difficult. We know the reasons. Electric cars, particularly in the United States, they tend to cost more than conventional cars. People are concerned, and rightly so, about places to charge and used vehicles and what happens to batteries. Is there a battery danger? What happens to spent batteries? There's all kinds of questions about how individually and collectively we can move from conventional cars to electric cars. But I just want to point out the momentum that already exists, right? This transition to electric vehicles, it is happening. It is definitely happening more slowly in the United States, but for various reasons, it is going to happen. And the question is really not about whether we change from conventional vehicles to electric vehicles, but how quickly that happens. And I just pulled a few statistics from 2022 car sales. So last year in Germany, 30% of new cars sold in that country were electric, either pure electric vehicles like Teslas, or these kind of plug-in hybrid vehicles that we don't have many of in the United States, but essentially vehicles that are primarily electric cars, but they also have kind of a backup gas engine when the juice runs out on electric. About a quarter of car sales in China last year were electric vehicles, and China is by far the largest car market in the world. A quarter of cars in the United Kingdom sold last year were electric. And Norway is sort of the global champion of electric vehicles, and that basically there are almost no new cars sold now in Norway that are powered by gasoline or diesel. And the figure in the United States, for what it's worth, about 6% of new cars sold in the United States are electric. That number roughly doubled last year, but it is still small, as you can sort of see. Wherever you live in the United States, apart from California, electric vehicles are relatively unusual. And look, I don't want to pretend that electric vehicles are some sort of silver bullet for all of our transportation problems. I think we can intuitively understand if you replace every vehicle on the road with an electric vehicle, traffic doesn't get better. I think there's actually some questions about whether they make traffic worse, because if it's cheaper and less hassle to drive and maintain an electric vehicle, people might drive more. So I want to be clear about that. And there's also concerns about the road safety impact of electric vehicles because they tend to be significantly heavier than conventional vehicles, particularly the ones sold in the United States. Ford and other companies, and other conventional car companies that are selling electric vehicles, they've put a lot of attention on sort of pickup trucks and other electrifying other large vehicles, which again, they are bigger and heavier, and electric versions of those vehicles are even bigger and heavier. So again, I don't want to pretend that this will magically solve all transportation problems, but the transition to electric vehicles is an important technology solution to at least the large problem of our individual and planetary health. Okay, sorry, that was just a move past that. Okay, I wanted to take a minute to talk a little bit about Uber and Lyft, because those transportation providers, there is a long history, particularly in the United States, of sort of technologies that promise to solve problems caused by cars. And, there's a really interesting historian named Peter Norton at the University of Virginia who writes about the history of the automobile, essentially. But if you want to look him up, one of the things he talks about is kind of promises, again, from the earliest days of cars, of making smart roadways, about radio technology that was sort of used to program missiles in the 1950s, being used to essentially make cars that could either drive themselves or that would drive closer together or that would kind of reduce congestion. There is this long history of promises of technology solutions sort of fixing traffic problems. And Uber came along and basically made a similar problem. That one of the big promises of Uber in the early 2010s, in particular when it first came on the market, was that the prevalence of Uber would make people drive less because you could take this inexpensive shared vehicle instead of driving your own car. It would cut traffic and traffic congestion, and it would reduce pollution. So I just want to point out that at least in the United States, that promise of Uber and Lyft has proven false. There's been a number of studies. Greg Earnhardt is the person I highlighted here, who's a prominent transportation researcher. But generally, study after study in both large and medium-sized cities have found that Uber and Lyft, in fact, made traffic and pollution worse, largely because rather than what was imagined in the 2010s of Uber and Lyft being services where I'm driving downtown to my place of work and I use Uber to pick up, one or two people on the way, a sort of carpooling service. Rather than that, I think we know that Uber and Lyft have essentially become kind of taxis, right? That people who are doing this semi-professionally, either on the side or as a full-time job, that is how Uber and Lyft generally function. And those people tend to drive around a lot, pardon me, without passengers. And that has increased, waiting to pick up passengers, essentially. And that has increased miles driven and traffic congestion and pollution in cities where they operate, at least in the United States. We can talk, I'm going to just move past this for time, but in other countries, there was a recent study in India, for example, that did find the introduction of Uber and Ola, which is a similar service in India, did seem to reduce the number of people who bought cars. And that is an important change, right? Because as countries get more affluent, people tend to own more cars and drive more, and that's good for them, convenient for them, but it is also contributing to air pollution and climate change. And India, as we know, is already has, many Indian cities already are among the world's worst in air pollution. Okay, so and AVs, for what it's worth, is the shorthand I'm using for autonomous vehicles or driverless cars. This is now the focus of a lot of attention and a lot of investment dollars to essentially replace at least some private cars or some conventional cars with driverless cars. And the main benefit, or the main purported benefit of this technology, is road safety, right? We know humans are prone to error. We make mistakes, we drive drunk, we drive drowsy, we drive distracted, and computers don't have those particular problems. So are driverless cars the solution to our road safety and maybe other problems? And I think my current thinking on this is they will help in limited circumstances. They are probably not the sort of magic solution to our road safety crisis. And it is very clear now that driverless vehicles will take decades to spread to mass market use. It is a very difficult technology to get right, and particularly when the stakes are so high. So I just wanted to pull this quote from Chris Urmson in 2021 to the New York Times. Chris is one of the kind of veteran driverless car technologists. And he essentially told the New York Times, this transition is going to happen over 30 years and possibly longer. And I just want to be clear that, when driverless cars first emerged around 2010, a lot of the predictions from people who were working on the technology was, this is right around the corner. This is going to be a sort of 5-year kind of project. And no one is saying that now. almost 15 years after driverless cars first started to be tested on American roads, most technologists are now saying, this is going to take a long time. The technology is really hard. It's harder than we expected. And particularly given the diversity of circumstances in which cars are driven. And I just wanted to, this was a piece published in my paper, in my current employer, the Washington Post, by David Zipper, who's a very smart transportation policy researcher at Harvard and elsewhere. And he is one of the leading skeptics that self-driving cars are actually safer than the current human piloted cars. And, I found this a very challenging, I mean, again, it seems logical that we know humans are error prone, and why can't computers do it better? And, it was just to quote this Carnegie Mellon autonomous technology specialist from David's piece, is that, he's essentially saying there is no empirical evidence right now, at least in the short and medium term, that autonomous vehicles will be safer than humans. And the reason for this is humans make mistakes all the time, but computers make mistakes too, as we know from our personal technology. And computers particularly struggle with sort of circumstances they've never seen before. And we know as drivers that happens all the time, that there are all these circumstances every single time we drive of something weird that we've never seen before. And our human brain can usually figure it out. And it's not necessarily the case for computers that are trained by learning from millions and millions and millions and billions of miles driven on conventional roadways. What happens the first time a car in a sort of famous autonomous vehicle test? What happens the first time a car encounters a duck in the road? And again, you can look up this particular example, but driverless cars were initially very confused by ducks. So, I think we may need to just have a little bit of a different metaphor in our brains about autonomous vehicles, that I think we have compared them, and I've done this too in my own mind, to autopilot in airplanes, which we know is a widely used technology and is generally very safe. But the difference between the skies and our roads is that our airspace is very tightly regulated. It is largely empty, and no planes in the United States are flying around without eyes on that and strict regulation around that. And our roadways do not work like that. Our roadways are just complicated. No one has to ask permission. And those are the kind of diverse, chaotic circumstances where computers might struggle. And so I have started to think about driverless cars less like airplane autopilot and more like automation in use in places like factory assembly lines and Amazon warehouses, right? Where machines and computers are working together in ways that in some cases make things more efficient, but in some cases also make humans more vulnerable. And we have to put guardrails around use of automation in those circumstances to protect humans and human life. Sorry, I'll just move on. So again, this is not to say that I think driverless vehicles, or that people like David Zipper think driverless vehicles shouldn't exist, but we may just need to be a little bit less ambitious about them, at least for now, right? So I think where driverless vehicles are proving very useful and safe is in limited uses. So retirement communities, one of the first places where driverless vehicles started to operate. And again, relatively predictable and small number of roads where computers have to do kind of less work. Long-haul trucks, particularly on interstate highways, where again, the road system is a little bit more predictable. That might be a very good use for autonomous vehicles. And in fact, there is lots of current testing underway. Ships, trains, things on fixed tracks, and things like golf carts. Again, low-speed vehicles where the computer has a little bit more time to make split-second decisions about, again, life and death. So I really want us to, this is how I have now started to think about technology and its ability to sort of solve those three big transportation problems that I mentioned: road safety, climate change, and pollution and traffic. That we just can't think of them anymore as magical fixes to problems, that we need to think about places where technology can help. And I think generally, as I mentioned with driverless cars, that we need to just be a little bit more measured about our expectations of what technology can and can't do. And I think that holds for electric vehicles as well. So again, I think the transition to electric vehicles is necessary and important, but we also need to be thinking about, okay, while we're making this transition, maybe not every vehicle on the road needs to be a large privately owned car or commercial vehicle. Electric vehicles can, power can also be very useful in all kinds of diverse vehicles. So electric cargo vans, and we're seeing the US Postal Service, in fact, start to introduce electric vans, particularly in sort of rural and suburban places where they drive relatively predictable routes. They can be plugged in overnight to recharge. That seems like a really great use for electric vehicle technology that doesn't require every American to sort of figure out how to charge their vehicles. The mini cars are becoming increasingly popular in many countries. These are sort of small cars. In some cases, they are singled out for people with disabilities. who may find it more comfortable to have a sort of smaller vehicles. I also want to think about e-bikes and e-scooters and electric commercial fleet vehicles, where again, these things can be charged overnight. Not everything needs to be a big private car. And I realize that is not going to work for every American. It's not going to work for everybody in the world. But we have had a paradigm in the United States where we have roads that are designed for large privately owned vehicles, and we have kind of one mode, right, where you're either a car or you're not a car, and you're treated as this sort of weird oddball. And we may want to think, when we're moving to electric vehicles, of making room for kind of a diversity of vehicles under different circumstances. And I also want to talk about some other uses of technology where it can be very helpful. Automated traffic enforcement is something that is widely used in some other countries, and Americans understandably are resistant to things like red light cameras and traffic cameras and things like that. But it is a circumstance where it saves money. It does catch more rule breaking and hopefully deter more rule breaking on the roads. Some people have also talked about automated traffic enforcement as a public safety benefit, particularly, unfortunately, we had another case recently of a road stop by police ending in a motorist's death, right? And there are some people in the Black Lives Matter community who are calling for police to simply not be involved in traffic stops, traffic enforcement. And then I also want to talk about driver assistance systems, right? Automatic emergency braking, pedestrian detection, technologies that are in many people's cars already, and that have proven benefits in many cases of making cars safer without, going all the way to driverless technology. And then lastly, I will just end by sort of encouraging, again, stealing this line from Apple, encouraging us to try to think different about transportation. If we're thinking about these transitions to electric vehicles, to autonomous vehicles, we definitely should and need to do that, particularly in settings where they make sense. But if we're rethinking aspects of transportation in the United States, can we also reimagine how we move people and goods around to rely less on cars and trucks in the first place? And again, I think this is very difficult for all of us. Cars are great. They enable us to have freedom to, we don't have to live close to where we work or where our family lives. We have benefited a lot from the transportation system as it exists today, but it has also brought, a lot of downsides. And so I think one of the interesting ideas is, what can we do differently that is not the status quo of cars as it exists today? I'll just mention a few of these quickly and move on. That other countries are not waiting for technology change to sort of improve climate change and cut road deaths. That they're doing untechnical things like redesigning streets in Finland that force cars to drive more slowly. Other countries, tax vehicle weight and fuel, and that encourages car companies to make smaller and safer vehicles. Japan is a very interesting, what Japan did, that they essentially have banned overnight street parking. It doesn't initially seem like that would be a safety measure, but it turns out that it makes particularly pedestrians and children more easily seen at night when there's not parked cars on the side of the road, right? So there's these other interventions, policy interventions we can make that improve traffic safety and reduce climate change, that are not sort of waiting for 30 years when autonomous vehicles get good enough or when everybody is driving an electric vehicle. So again, this is a piece that I wrote, I'm plugging myself, in 2021 with Peter Norton, the University of Virginia professor that I already mentioned, the historian of automotive, of the auto industry in the United States. And Peter Norton has essentially come to the conclusion of, yes, we need to make the transition, particularly to electric vehicles, but what if we also took some portion of the money, the government money and the commercial money that's invested in technologies like electric vehicles and autonomous vehicles, and also spent them on, unflashy product and policy changes. So, he mentioned sort of zoning codes to permit homes to be built in the same places or close by stores and schools and workplaces so that Americans, if they choose, don't have to drive everywhere. What if we invested more in public transit, which again has both safety improvements and climate improvements? Bicycles and electric railways that don't require batteries are really fascinating technology marvels that do good. And again, not every driverless car or electric vehicle needs to be a privately owned car, can also be an electric bicycle or an electric railroad, right? These things that have material transportation improvements, but only if we make space, right, in both our policy and our roadways for things that are something other than cars. And this quote from Dr. Norton, he's talking about essentially, the long history, as I mentioned, of technology promising to sort of make perfect cars, make cars that don't crash, make cars that can drive close together so that there's less traffic. And I think Peter Norton's conclusion from his historical research is that this whole promise over decades of tech making perfect cars depends on us agreeing that high tech is better tech. And he says, I don't think we can really stand up that philosophy. So I think that's it for me. I really appreciate your time and your insights. I confess that I wasn't looking at your questions as I was going, so let me do that now. Or obviously, feel free to sort of raise your hand, or however, Jonathan, however you guys do questions. I'm just going to stop sharing my screen if I can figure out how to do that. There we go. Okay. So let me see if I can get to your questions. Sorry, let me open up the chat again.
For starters, Shira, do you know what's the rate of new car EVs in California? You mentioned that it was higher than 6%, but how high has it gotten?
I've forgotten that number. It's something like 15 or 20% in California, which I think goes to show, right? California made this transition earlier and also had incentives for EVs earlier, including things like being able to drive in HOV lanes, right? Which is something that also proved very effective in encouraging electric car vehicle purchase in Norway and other places. So, that's a sign of the effect of public policy, right, on making people interested in driverless cars. Sorry, I'll just go to, I think James it is, who had his hand raised, and then I will go to the chat questions too.
Go ahead,
Thank
Jim.
Thank you for that. Can you hear me?
I can, yes.
Thank you for that great presentation. What do you think the effect of people working more from home in urban areas like Washington, D.C. will have on the whole issue?
It's a great question. So I think interestingly, and we don't know how this is going to pan out, right? Because I think we're all still figuring out how durable hybrid work or work from home will be. But interestingly, so far, it doesn't seem like in 2021 and 2022, for example, it seems like in some circumstances, people who worked more from home did not actually drive less. And again, it makes some intuitive sense. So if we replace our daily commute with, instead I can go out in the afternoon and go to Starbucks and have a coffee, or drive to the grocery store, and maybe I would have done that on my way home from work otherwise, right? I would have stopped by on my way home from work and picked up a few things on my drive back to work. Instead, maybe I make a separate trip to the grocery store, right? So that kind of increases miles driven. I don't know if I think all of this is way too new for anybody to draw conclusions from the 2 or 3 years of data that we have so far. But it's interesting that we can't necessarily assume that if people work from home more, that actually means people drive less. I just want to, I saw several questions in the chat about sort of the environmental issues of electric batteries, particularly because they require mining of these scarce minerals like lithium. And I think it's a great question. And it's a really hard problem. I don't want to ignore the real toll on both humans who mine these minerals and on our environment from digging up these precious, dangerous minerals. It is getting more efficient to do this. It has to, but I totally understand that is an environmental downside of something that is presented as a environmental benefit, right, from electric vehicles. I'll say a couple other things. It will get better. Governments are regulating this a lot more. It's definitely a problem. It does help. Again, the issue I talked about of more diversity of electric vehicle types, right? If you have a smaller vehicle, it is going to require smaller batteries and therefore less of these precious resources for the batteries and to charge the batteries. So, that is something that we can also incentivize or disincentivize, right? A Ford F-150 Lightning that weighs, I don't know what the vehicle weight is, but that weighs 10,000 pounds, that's going to use far more mineral resources to build for the batteries than a cargo bicycle or a cargo van or a mini car or just a smaller car, a sort of Toyota a Honda Civic sized car. So, that's something to think about. It's really hard. You don't want to make environmental trade-offs that totally negate the environmental benefits of an electric car, but I also want to be mindful of the huge environmental benefit from making the transition to electric vehicles. And if we can mitigate some of the harm from the mineral extraction and the batteries, that only helps. But I agree that that's a huge issue. Sorry, I'm just reading through more of your questions, but again, feel free to ask in the chat.
I'm going to jump in,
please,
to make a comment, because many of us, even if we would like to use other forms of transportation, are sort of trapped in the suburbs.
Yes.
My son, for example, because of his health issues, he wouldn't even be able to walk the half mile or so to a bus stop. And he's looking at a Ford Lightning now. He's trying to save up his money for that, because when he drives a truck like that, he feels safer in it. Totally. Rather than a small car getting out on the beltway and, competing with other big vehicles like the 18-wheelers and all. He figures he's going to get totally crunched and mashed if he's out there in that situation. But anyway, the suburbs make you, we're a mile from a grocery store, which is closer than some people, but it's not really possible to get along without a car. Even a motorbike would not have the capacity to carry much in the way of groceries if you had to go to the store.
I totally agree. And look, I agree that for some people, maybe for most people, we need cars. And that's going to be the reality for a long time. So I just want to bring up a couple points. One is, I found it really instructive to do some research into Norway. Again, Norway is not the United States for many, many reasons. But again, right now, and they made this transition very quickly, and it's not going to happen that fast here. But right now, almost, like 10% of cars sold in Norway have conventional engines, and they've also, made a transition to sort of rethinking circumstances where cars are necessary. And one thing that was instructive, at least to me, from their experience is, they're just as car centric as we are. And one thing that was very powerful is they didn't try to say, well, everybody has to have an electric car, everybody has to have no car, right? They sort of thought about easy wins, right? If you have a second car, if you, just to your point about the grocery store, maybe it makes no sense to ride, a bicycle and then like come back for a mile. That makes no sense with a whole flotilla of groceries. But in some places where there is more, more ownership of things that are not big private vehicles, maybe a second smaller car, right, that you use for short errands might make sense. Maybe a cargo bike makes sense, right? It may not make sense in every circumstance, but you can imagine you can start picking off these sort of easier wins. And again, your son, who understandably wants a bigger, safer vehicle, that totally makes sense. I mean, one of the sort of, again, this is a kind of collective challenge that when we all buy or want bigger vehicles that protects us, and it does, it also makes it dangerous for everyone else, right? So it's this kind of race where we want bigger cars because other people have bigger cars, and so it's safer if we have a bigger car, and the cars just keep getting bigger and bigger so that we all protect us. And there may be a role for regulation here, right? Again, I'm not saying nobody can own a big car or a big pickup truck, but if there are circumstances where vehicle size is regulated more in some way, and we're less worried about somebody else driving a 8-foot tall, Hummer, right? And we have to have a equally large vehicle to protect ourselves. If fewer people have giant cars, we can be safer in smaller vehicles too. But I'm not going to pretend that any of this stuff is easy or is easy for everyone.
At least he is looking at an electric car. He's done with gas guzzlers. Doesn't
You know what?
want that anymore, ever.
I think that's a win.
I've had a long life, and I've had a chance to have a perspective from all the way back in the 40s to the current. And, we've worked our way through a lot of cars. And I've always tried to get economical ones, but I got a hybrid this last time around after using a Toyota for 15 years. So, there's an evolution, and we're trying to be more environmentally careful as we go along. My husband, of course, loved his pickup trucks and rarely worried about the gas mileage. But I wonder now, if he were still alive, I think his attitude probably would be very different. And
Yeah,
I think many of us are changing in that way.
I mean, and I think that most Americans aren't going to buy electric vehicles because for climate reasons, and maybe they shouldn't. Most people are going to buy electric vehicles because they're fun to drive. If you've ever driven one, they're pretty fun to drive. They're significantly cheaper to own and maintain. The maintenance costs are lower. Obviously, you're not buying gas. Charging them is cheaper. The cars do cost more right now. That's going to change as there's more competition. And again, we've already seen that in China, where the competition in the electric vehicle market in China is fierce, and vehicle prices have come down to the point where the government is really government incentives are no longer a major factor in China, that people are choosing those cars because they want to, and not because there's sort of incentives to do so, right? So that's kind of maybe a peek into the potential future in the United States or other countries, where eventually these cars just become competitive on their own. And you can see that, like General Motors said a couple of years ago, they're going to stop making conventional cars I actually forgot what deadline they said, 2035, 2040, something like that.
Right.
And part of that is in response to governments in China, in Canada, and Germany, and the UK, and Norway, and now in California, all saying we're just not going to allow sales of new gas-powered cars in a few years, right? So car companies can see the future. They know that the conventional product they made is an endangered species. And that's why you're seeing a lot of change now, in addition to, Tesla, I think, basically just completely changing the mindset of what a car is, right? A car is no longer a mechanical product that you make once and never change. An electric car is basically an iPhone on wheels, right? It has a software brain, and it can everything, the transmission system, the braking system, everything in the car can be remotely updated like our phones are, right? It was again, whenever you think of Elon Musk, what Tesla did was really fundamentally rethink what a car is, from a mechanical one-time, you make it once and never adapt it again product, to essentially a software-driven product like our phones. And, and also Tesla made electric cars seem cool and desirable. And I don't think we can't overlook the power of what Tesla and what Elon Musk did for that electric vehicle transition.
In another area, if I can just stay with you for a minute, over on the Eastern Shore, something is happening that seems, in a way, a step forward and maybe a step back. I'm not sure at this moment. There used to be in this peninsula, which is a couple hundred miles long, a railroad that ran right down the spine of it. And for many years, it was thriving when the seafood industry was also thriving. But then as cars and trucks became the big deal and the highways were improved and widened and so forth, the railroad fell into disuse, and various attempts to revive it failed. So now it's being torn up completely, and it will be repaved as a bike and walking trail all the way down. But I'm wondering whether that's really a very good idea. I mean, if only an electric railroad could have been, built and become a popular way to get down the peninsula, it seems like that might have been better.
Yeah, I'm afraid I don't know enough about that particular roadway,
right,
but I
sure.
hear your point, right? That it is definitely true that we in the United States, we let a lot of infrastructure, period, languish, and we can see that on our roads and bridges. But that was particularly true of a kind of shared transportation, right? Trains, buses, subways, things that are not people driving around by publicly owned cars. And there is kind of there's sort of a reverse momentum when you disinvest in transit, right? People, you can see that in the metro system in DC, right? It got worse and people are taking it less, and then it gets even worse as people take it less, right?
It's a problem.
And it's definitely a problem. But I just want to be clear that, that shared transportation has, when it's invested in, when it's good, and unfortunately we do it very badly in the United States, all transportation infrastructure in the United States is expensive and takes way too long to build and is poorly maintained. That goes for roads and that goes for transit. But when it's done right, that has such a profound effect on all three problems of the current transportation system that I mentioned: It's better for road safety. Again, shared transit has proven to be statistically safer than people driving themselves. It's better for climate change, and it reduces traffic congestion. I saw recently in your backyard in Arlington, Virginia, a research study of traffic patterns since I think 1980. And those were decades when the population of Arlington, as you guys know, exploded, and traffic in Arlington peaked in 2000 and has declined since then. And look, there's all kinds of reasons for that, and it may not translate to every suburb or every place in the United States, but you can see Arlington became physically transformed. There's more like dense buildings, high-rise towers, more housing close to transit, so people don't have to drive in circumstances where they don't need to. But that goes to show that, just because there are more people, it doesn't mean that you have to have more driving. Again, that's not going to be applicable for everywhere in the United States, but it does go to show you some of the power of sort of thinking different, again, to steal the Apple line that I used, just kind of reimagining, does every place in the United States need to look like where I grew up in Ohio, in Dayton, Ohio, right? These like sprawling, entirely car dependent, dominated by single family home developments that are kind of isolated from anywhere where we shop or go to school or meet people or go to work, right? So that's just one of the things I want to talk about. And then Jonathan, I see your hand raised. I don't want to ignore you. Jonathan, can you hear me?
Yeah. Sorry.
No
I
worries.
was just in the chat. Mike Emery posted a link to Rails to Trails. Do you know them?
I do know them, and I think they're the ones that built my dad lives near Poughkeepsie, New York, and I think there's a Rails to Trails project over the Hudson River there. That's really amazing.
It's all around the country, and
Yeah.
I first touched it. That it was a Rails to Trails for the Capitol Crescent Trail that in Metro DC runs from Bethesda to Georgetown. And if you bike or walk along there, it's just amazing. It's so close in because it was a rail line that supplied goods. Anyway, the first one comment and then a question. I don't think you should give up that you can't go to the grocery store without a car. Because in bicycling around, I have seen so many colors and flavors of pedal assist cargo bikes. Interestingly, some of the young families who don't use cars, they use these cargo bikes, and they tell me that the big problem they have in going to the grocery store is that the kids want to be in the back. So don't give up that, because there are options now that many people are using. The question I guess I had was, it's frustrating to me that we've had no kind of regulatory pushback against the size and weight increases that have nothing to do with EVs that were a big problem. I was taken by a YouTube of a young mother who ran over her baby in her driveway because she was in a big SUV and didn't see her kid. And one of the things she said was, why didn't they tell me that if I were in the car, I would be safer, but my kids outside the car would not be safer? So this has gotten to a crazy point. And how can we incentivize away from this?
Yeah, so I think those are great question and a great point. And let me talk about both of those. So on the size and weight of cars, it's definitely true. Look, I completely understand. I mean, I like driving a bigger car. You can, you're higher, you can see more, you are statistically safer. I will say in many other countries, so in the United States, we measure car safety only by the safety of people inside the vehicle in crashes, right? We've all seen those like crash test dummies, right, in cars that are driven into walls. And that's how federal regulations for car safety are made, based purely on the safety of people in the vehicles. In other countries, they also measure safety of people outside a vehicle. So that might be other cars, or that might be, children or other people on foot or on motorcycles or on bicycles, right? And, that is a profoundly different regulatory scheme. And I don't know the answer to this, but I do wonder, in another country, some of these cars, and I certainly see them in my neighborhood too, even in New York City, these cars that are, the front end is sort of feels like it's 5 feet high, where it would be very difficult to see someone or something right in front of the vehicle. I do wonder if that would be just out of regulation in many countries where they do consider the safety of more than just the occupants of the vehicle. So I think that's a fair point. Somebody put in the chat that in some places, and I know for sure in Washington, D.C., I think Roy mentioned Virginia, which I'm not familiar with, but there are, I know DC has put in this kind of surcharge, basically larger vehicle surcharge. You can still buy one, but the registration fees are significantly higher for sort of bigger, taller vehicles.
I think Montgomery County is headed to that also.
And look, we don't tend to like that kind of stuff. And I totally understand. I completely understand this, right? You don't. It makes me feel uncomfortable for the government to sort of say you can drive this car, but not that car. I get it, but it's also true that there's all kinds of regimes in the United States where we regulate or tax things that we want more of and things that we want less of, right? We have a tax regime in the United States. It gives you a mortgage interest rate deduction because we think owning a home is good, and so all of us subsidize home ownership in the United States. We tax things that we don't like. We tax cigarettes because we think smoking is harmful, both individually and socially. And so we tax that heavily to discourage smoking. And so, we may just have to learn to think a little bit differently about transportation. And I will say, whatever. Okay, I'll say that. And then just to your point about cargo bikes, I think cargo bikes, I do not have one, but I think they're great. To me, the most interesting use of cargo bikes is in some cities in the United States and elsewhere in the world. In dense urban areas, they don't allow delivery trucks. Because, we've all seen this, right? You get like these giant UPS trucks that are like double parked somewhere downtown, and they block traffic, and it's really annoying. And they're like, it's sort of one of these cases of, do we really need this? And also in some countries, cars are sort of heavily restricted in business districts or in other areas where there's a lot of people and commerce. And so, the delivery companies like UPS and Amazon, they've used cargo bikes, electric cargo bikes, to deliver packages. I think they're great for that. But again, I don't blame anybody who doesn't want to take a cargo bike to the grocery store. I'm thinking about like where my dad lives, again, in the Hudson Valley of New York. He also lives a mile or something like that from the Walmart supercenter. I am a fairly confident urban cyclist. I would never ride my bicycle to that grocery store because, it's like 6-lane roadway, and there's sort of this one intersection that I have to bike through that's like, I don't know, 6 lanes in one direction and 4 lanes in another direction. Like, I would never do that, right? So, there are a lot of circumstances where that makes no sense. And it's, again, this sort of momentum effect, right? If we, it's a chicken and egg problem, right? If our roads are designed primarily to move people around in cars and trucks, it means that the roads and also are less safe for anything that is not a car and truck. And so I don't blame anybody who's like, no way I'm taking a cargo bike to the grocery store. I wouldn't do that. So, there has to be, it can't just be individual change. It also has to be kind of social change to rethink just how we think about moving around in our shared space, which is hard. I just want to be clear that it's hard.
Thanks so much. Let's go to Bill and then Lawrence.
Yeah, three shorter comments and one a little bit longer. Fire departments have needed to be retrained on how to deal with electric vehicles in accidents, and particularly if they're on fire. It takes more water to put them out, and they're prone to actually reignite even hours or days later. Second, there's now a conflict with taxes. There are promotions and subsidies to purchase cars and benefits like being able to get in the rush hour lanes, but also that reduces the taxes, the gas taxes that are paid for maintaining the roads. So some places are now charging people with electric vehicles in order to compensate for that. Also, with an all-electric vehicle, what's kept me from getting that is that it used to be, it's gotten better now, but we used to have frequent power outages. And without a generator and you have a power outage, you're dead in the water if you have an electric vehicle and it's discharged. The final thing is Montgomery County is really aggressively increasing its density. And that's people per the same amount. They're allowing single family homes to be replaced with duplexes, triplexes, even quadplexes. So as more and more people do transition to electric cars, we need more and more power stations to power them. And with a property owner, okay, with more people on the same property and more vehicles, that creates an infrastructure issue. How do you charge all of these cars? So I just wanted to make those comments and see if you had any reaction to any of them.
Yes, I think those are all great points. And I agree that those are definitely, I mean, those are all issues. So I'll try to take them in order. About the battery fires.
Well, hold on just a second.
Yes,
I
please.
just want to back up. We have two Prius Primes. Okay, we are hybrid fans. I am in favor of electric vehicles. I just see a lot of issues.
Yes, I think those are all, look, those are all real problems. I'm not an expert in battery fires. I've read a bit about it. If you're interested, Aaron Gordon, who's a journalist with Vice, he's written quite a bit about vehicle fires, maybe less so recently. I don't pretend to understand the issues involved, but yes, battery fires are definitely a risk, both in cars and in some other things like electric bicycles. My understanding is that can be mitigated over time with better technology. But yeah, it is definitely, it is a safety risk. Does that mean that, again, I don't want to mitigate any of the downsides, including this sort of lithium and other mineral issue or battery fires or other problems with electric vehicles. But I also, it's sort of a balancing act, right? That anything new comes with downside, but staying the same also has profound downsides. So it's a matter of how do you mitigate the new downsides that you're creating by moving away from one scheme to another. But the battery fire thing is real. The gas tax thing, I think that's a really interesting point. And again, Norway, where I've done some research about their electric vehicle transition. Initially, one of the drivers of electric vehicle purchase adoption in Norway was Norway has very high vehicle registration and gas taxes, and electric vehicle owners initially got breaks, essentially, not full breaks, but they got significant discounts in registration and obviously, I didn't have to pay gas taxes. And now Norway has started to remove some of those some of those discounts for electric vehicle ownership. So, that may be the case in the future. We're definitely not there yet in the United States, where, electric vehicle ownership is so low that it's not really having an impact on, gas tax or these other taxes that we make from cars. But remember that, there's also a government price from the current transportation system, right? Again, those 40,000 road deaths in the United States, again, EVs aren't going to make that better, but that's just to say that is also those are public costs too, right? Or many times when there's a car crash, that requires healthcare, police, if that person is on, Medicare or some other public insurance program, that is a public cost, right? And again, I'm not saying EVs are going to improve that, but I'm also saying, we also need to think about the public cost of the current transportation system compared to the public cost of the new system. We don't know what that is necessarily. It's not a one-to-one thing. But we have to think about public cost in all sorts of ways. The power outages thing, I totally hear you. Again, I think the important thing to think about is what are sort of the easier wins we can pick off. Maybe it's not you, or maybe it's not someone who lives in an area where they do have regular power outages, but there are people, I think a good number of people who live in a single family home with a garage where they do have a plug, or they can get a plug in their garage, and they do have reliable, regular power, that's more feasible, right? So, we don't have to make an electric vehicle like appealing and desirable or necessary for every single person. If they can be appealing and manageable for a good chunk of people, again, that builds momentum over time. And then just to your point about, Montgomery County and density, and then obviously more people, it puts more strain on the electrical grid from EVs or from anything else, right? I also got, dishwashers and TVs and other electrical appliances in their home. It is definitely true that the power infrastructure in the United States, the power grid in the United States, is not ready for an electric world. If tomorrow we changed every car in the United States to an electric car, and we made every gas stove an electric stove, and we made every water heater an electric water heater, there is no way that our power grid could handle that. It would crater. But it's not going to happen tomorrow. And these energy transitions are happening now, and they will happen slowly over time. It will require a lot of work and probably a lot of policy changes. And I don't know what the future holds, but again, other countries are ahead of us in this transition to electric cars. And to my knowledge, I have not heard of mass power outages in Germany or something like that, because all these new electric cars or housing density kind of put a strain on the electrical grid. So, I do think that those countries that are sort of have a little bit more experience with this, they can be instructive, right? We as Americans tend to think we're different, and we are in many ways. I don't want to discount that, but it is also true there's a lot of lessons we can learn from other parts of the world.
Shira, quickly following that up. So did Norway spend billions of dollars upgrading their grid to be able to handle the electric cars?
No, Norway is a very interesting country. They also have a huge amount of hydropower and other. So the answer is no. That they already they're in a different energy place than the United States is.
Okay, let's turn to Lawrence now.
Hello there. I was very pleased with your presentation. It coincides a lot with my thoughts on the subject. I was wondering if you'd given too much thought to the role of urban planning in this. When I was in Japan, I could walk a kilometer and get on a train, go anywhere in the country. And when I was on the East Coast for a quarter century, if I wanted to take a train to DC, I had to drive to Baltimore, take a subway to the train station, take the train to DC, and then get on the subway to go where I wanted. And that did not change in a quarter century, which is absolutely ridiculous. So have you looked into the role of urban planning in this sort of thing?
Yes. Okay. I agree with you. I am not I'm not an urban planning specialist, but I will tell you that when I was at the New York Times, and when I was particularly when I started doing some of this research on transportation, the person I probably talked to most was my then colleague Connor Doherty, who writes about sort of housing and urban planning at the New York Times, who is excellent, by the way. Just read everything Connor writes. But you're right that housing and transportation go hand in hand, right? One of the reasons that Americans drive so much is because we're not unique in this, but we are one of those countries where people tend to live in discrete residential areas that are separated by zoning or by practice from where they work, where they shop, where they go to school, where their friends live, things like that. So again, you are probably right that in order to change the way we move around people and goods, we may also have to think differently about housing and how our streets and suburbs and exurbs are designed. And again, this is all very difficult. But I do want to make clear that the way that we live, the way that we live and the way that we move around in the United States, these were all that was also a change, right? We think of this as normal, the way that we live now as normal. These were all choices that at some point we made collectively or individually, right? The interstate highway system didn't exist, and then it did. And that was at times a very contentious change in the United States, right? There were whole neighborhoods and cities that were bulldozed to make way for the interstate highway system. People fought against it. And now we think of that as this is just normal, but it wasn't always normal. And so not every place in the United States will ever look like Tokyo or even like Arlington, Virginia, and that's okay. But I do think the challenge that we have in the United States is that for the most part, you don't really have a choice. There is, as you said, even if you live in most East Coast cities, there is really nothing like a city in Japan, in the United States, where it's a little bit more dense, where you do have a lot of transit, a lot of options that are not driving a big car. Maybe you drive a little car, maybe you ride a bicycle, maybe you take these amazing high-speed trains everywhere, maybe you take a bus, and we just have fewer choices. The default mode in the United States is you have to drive a lot, and you have to drive a lot in a car, and you live far away, and probably your home is going to be a single family home, and that is the status quo in the United States. But there are a lot of downsides to that status quo, as you're finding out, including, frankly, we don't have enough housing to meet the demand for housing in places where people want to live. And so a lot of the problems that we're encountering are a result of choices that we made over many decades, which brought us a lot of benefits, right, to sort of develop this primacy of the single family home and primacy of the car and truck as the way to move around people and goods. And I think we're now being confronted with the challenges of those choices that we made many decades ago. And I think what I'm trying to do is to sort of ask, can we just start to change that even on the margins in a way that I think will have benefits? And we may not have a choice, right? Like the housing issue, that we can't build single family homes enough to satisfy the demand for housing in places where people want to live. So, we may have to have more density in some places.
Thank you.
other questions about transportation? Shira, I wonder, did you want to touch briefly on one of the other topics that you talked about at our previous meeting?
Well, let me just mention one. Well, actually, no. You know what? If people are interested in other things, instead of me picking, I will just ask other people if there's other things that they're interested in talking about, rather than
I do
me
have
picking.
I have another question specifically about gender, and in the fact that you're a tech writer. Once upon a time, my PhD spouse we were at a computer show, and she was asking questions of people about computer technology, and the salespeople would turn to me and give me the answer. And this really torqued her off, because she has a PhD in health informatics and I don't. I'm wondering if you still see that sort of thing today. And I'm picking on you as a tech writer because it seems to crop up there more than some places.
Yeah, I mean, look, it's hard to ignore the reality that when I go to places that are techy, right? Tech conferences, tech companies, tech events, it is a lot of men. And, that does feel isolating. I don't know, something. It doesn't feel great, let's put it that way. And I certainly, as a journalist and as just a woman in the world, I've definitely had those experiences like what you described, right? Where I have this very distinct memory of being at a lunch with my editor, a male editor, and I will not name him, but a technology CEO. And I was sure that I would ask him things, and I was sure that he was turning to my male editor and answering my question to him. And in my brain, I'm like screaming, right? Not to him, but to myself, just like, what the hell is this guy doing? This is driving me crazy. And I think eventually I asked enough questions where he finally started to actually look at me when he was responding to my questions. But, I'm sure if you ask any woman in any profession or just in the world, they have had at least some experiences like that. So, it's definitely an issue. The reality too is that, as a journalist, I am not of the tech industry, right? By, sort of both ethically and otherwise, I'm sort of an observer in a way, right? I am not a technologist. I report on this industry, and that gives me some sense of remove. So, whatever issues of race and gender the tech industry has, and frankly, the journalism industry has, I'm somewhat removed from them. I can just sort of see, right? Boy, there's a lot of these spaces are very white and very male, or this tech CEO is not looking at me when he's answering my questions. I can see that and in a way be a sort of a detached observer as much as I can. Although again, I was screaming in my head when this man wouldn't look at me when he was answering my questions. So yeah, that's my answer.
Do you know, Shira, we had a wonderful presentation by a woman named Rebecca Enenchong, who's a business tech entrepreneur. And the story she told was she went to a meeting that her top sales guy had arranged with a new customer to add, buzz to it. And the new customer would talk to the sales guy and not to her. And the sales guy had to later approach this guy and say, do you really want to do business with our company? She's the CEO.
Wow. Yeah, that's some chutzpah, yeah.
Yeah, so we had, I think, some distance to go where all members of our community will be represented at all levels. So there won't be this. Okay, sorry about that. So next to Michael Goldstein.
Oh, hi. I think AVs might be more effective if they could talk to each other and tell each other what they're going to do. Are there any projects going on to allow networking of the cars?
I think that's an interesting question. Trying to remember, there are some states, and I can't remember if it's California or somewhere else, where there's extensive AV testing going on right now. But I think there are some places that have some requirements about cars talking to one another, particularly this issue of, if it's all Waymo cars. Waymo is the sibling company of Google that's working on autonomous vehicles. Those cars do talk to one another. But if it's a Waymo car and a Cruise car, Cruise is the General Motors driverless car project, they may not instinctively talk to one another. I think that is a problem that will be solved by either regulation or improvements in communication technology, or both. And at least right now, driverless cars are not on the roads in such large numbers that the communication gaps among them has been a dominant issue. It might in the future, but right now, I think smartly, most of the places where driverless cars are in use, in testing, there are limits on how many driverless cars can be on the public roads at any one time. And did I mention that San Francisco complained to California regulators? I think I did. Okay. Anyway, there have been some issues, and I think Waymo, again, which is the Google sibling company, they have been extremely cautious about driverless cars, and I think to their credit and to the credit of regulators, that where Waymo started first was in the suburbs of Phoenix, Arizona, where, if you've been there, the roads are long, straight, flat roads with not a lot going on, right? It's not like New York City, right, where you have like pedestrians and children running in the street and delivery vehicles. It is, a fairly predictable road environment. It's also always sunny, right? There's not a lot of rain or snow or other things that trip up computer-driven cars. And that's the place where Waymo has been operating AVs for the longest. And they operate essentially a robot taxi service, a driverless car taxi service. We haven't heard a lot about it, partly because Google has been very secretive about that project, but that does feel like, at least for now, that is a promising use case for driverless cars, is in these predictable environments where there's not a lot of variation of either what's happening in the roads or weather. So chaotic environments like New York City might take a little longer.
Gatorade, but well, even if non-driverless cars.
Could you all mute yourself?
But I mean,
sorry, Mike, is that you?
That's not me. This is me.
I think
I'm just
muted
asking
it.
if even non-driverless cars would talk to other cars.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, I didn't understand. Yes, I think that is also something that I think will eventually happen. It's not happening. It's not happening now. And I think there's questions about whether that's necessary, right? The point, or one of the points of the driverless car, is that it essentially it is supposed to see, using air quotes there, see the environment around it, with extensive sensors, right? And so they do have a sense of, by necessity, they have to be aware of the environment around them. But it is generally, you're right, it is generally one-way communication, right? It is the driverless car, air quotes, seeing other cars or other, again, people, road construction, ducks. It is seeing that through sensors rather than, obviously I don't have like a sensor on myself where a driverless car is going to communicate with me over, airwaves.
So, but following that up, Shira, are there any of the niches that you think are promising for these AVs that would need and use coordination between them pretty robustly sooner than?
No, I mean, I think the environment where AVs are going to be useful in the near term, I think a lot of that communication is already baked in. Again, I mentioned the sort of Phoenix suburbs, right? These very predictable road environments. I mentioned sort of retirement communities or these other kind of relatively small kind of neighborhoods, right? Where again, a computer can kind of map the road network in a retirement community or a gated community and, have a very good understanding of what's happening in a relatively confined space, confined and relatively predictable space. And again, where there are low speeds. The driverless trucks, particularly driverless long haul trucks, it's again a predictable roadway environment, generally at a relatively fixed speed with not an interstate is like a Phoenix suburb, right? You have a long straight road that is relatively predictable. What's going on is relatively predictable. Those things do, again, I'm using air quotes, talk to one another, right? So, those are the environments where autonomous vehicles and ships too, I'll mention ships and trains. Those are spaces where, because of the nature of just the general nature of the environment, there's just less going on. So there's less need for this sort of real-time active communication among vehicles and other road users.
Thank you, Shira. Let's go now to George Hogeman. George?
Hi, yeah. Speaking of this, so out here we had a pilot project of an autonomous vehicle that was running from the Dunloring metro station to the Mosaic district, which is a few blocks away. That entailed crossing Route 29, which is very busy. We saw it once or twice. There are signs up about it. Haven't seen it in months. So I don't know if it's still operating or whether they ended that project or whether it, had problems.
That's interesting. I was unfamiliar with that project. I mean, do you happen to know what company's autonomous cars they were? No.
It was a very distinctive vehicle. I think it had we only saw it once or twice. I think it probably had a nominal driver, because it was a project, but it was a very distinctive kind of bubble mobile-like vehicle, maybe sat 8 or 9 people. And it would be a sensible thing because crossing Route 29 is, there's like 4 or 5 lanes in every direction, lots of turn lanes. And so to bring people from the metro to Mosaic District, where all these new restaurants, theater, and so forth it seemed like an ideal kind of pilot project. So
I agree with you. I mean, I do think again, if you have something that is going on a route, I mean, this is like a bus basically, right? Or sort of a short bus. It's going the same route all the time. Those are, I think, more predictable, right? You're going back and forth on the same stretch of road all the time. Obviously, the other cars and people and road construction, other things, those do change, but at least the computer can sort of map the roadway extensively and have some sense of regular traffic patterns. So those are good use cases. And your point about the driver in the car is actually a good point. So when we talk about driverless cars right now, in most cases, it's a misnomer. In many places where driverless cars are being tested, by regulation, there has to be a safety driver in the car. So it is a human who is there to take over in circumstances where the car messes up, it gets confused, it's doing something dangerous, So in many cases, again, depending on the state or city where the driverless car is being tested, in many cases, there actually is a human in the car. Unfortunately, you do get these circumstances in Arizona a number of years ago. There was an Uber car. Uber was then operating a driverless car test program. It is no longer operating that, but there was a circumstance where an Uber driverless car was being tested on a public roadway with a safety driver I believe in the passenger seat, who could sort of take over or operate the car in circumstances where they needed to. And in this case, there was a failure of both the driverless car system and the human backup driver, where there was a person crossing the road at night. The computer did not see the person. The backup driver was not paying attention at that particular moment, and she didn't brake in time, didn't brake the car in time. And unfortunately, the Uber car hit and killed that person. So, you know, again, there are 40,000 traffic fatalities in the United States every year. And one road death, as unfortunate as it was, at the hands of a driverless car and a backup driver, does not negate the value of a driverless car. But it is important to note that for regulatory reasons right now, there is often a backup driver in the wheel, or there are remote monitoring. There are people doing remote monitoring of those vehicles in many cases, even when there's not a person physically in the car. The car is being real-time monitored remotely, and there is somebody who can take over. And again, that is all the result of regulation that, frankly, for reasons that we want, most places are not willing to basically make us, all of us who share the roads and sidewalks, not willing to make us human guinea pigs for half-baked driverless car technology. And frankly, that's as it should be. So it's a good point that I did just want to say that using the term driverless car is a little bit of a misnomer, at least right now, because there is often a human physically in the car or remote backup.
So
Yeah, it looks like Relay is the company that was doing this.
Relay, I haven't heard of.
Maureen.
I don't think I've ever heard of that company. I'll have to look that
I
up.
just put a link in the chat, and it says the shuttle operates Monday to Thursday, 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. So it's a
Right.
fairly.
And again, that is probably, it doesn't want to operate in rush hour, probably because it's too chaotic, right?
Yep.
And it doesn't want to operate at night because, you know, even computers, it's just a different visibility at night. So, you know, it's all about making, again, this is what we do with technology, is that at least initially, we confine the technology to relatively niche circumstances until the technology gets better, right? And that's how technology always works, is it starts in this kind of, you start with a very small problem, and then you kind of expand the scope of the problem.
Well,
Sorry, Roy.
I'm still running, and as of September, and so because I thought maybe it had crashed and burned for some reason, but anyway,
Yeah.
Thank you.
Let's turn next to Pi President Roy Wagner. Roy, you have the floor.
I was going to say, segueing on a small scale and testing this type of thing, and relative to George Mason University, is if you go walk around their campus, they have the little mini cars or mini things delivering pizzas. And they have to contend with crossing crosswalks and cars and people, avoiding people. It's very interesting. I'm sure that those are prevalent on many college campuses. So, but it's that same technology of a fixed environment.
It's exactly right.
Avoiding people, avoiding cars. And I bet a lot of college students challenge them significantly to hit them.
Yes, they are, I think, stolen quite often. But yes, you're right. Those little robots that basically deliver food, right, on college campuses, those have gotten more prevalent. And you're right, that's an example of a niche use case of autonomous vehicles. Although I will also point out, again, I said driverless car is a misnomer. Those autonomous robots, delivery robots, are also a misnomer, because there does tend to be human monitoring of those things when they do get like stolen by college kids or like kicked by college kids. I think there was one on Berkeley's campus a few years ago that caught on fire, and students had to like put out the fire with a fire extinguisher. I don't know how that happened, but they get into trouble.
Yes, and the technology on the roadways, like the trucks and things like that, some of the newer cars have the features where it tracks the lane, so it's watching for
Yes.
lanes that can proceed in a straight route, mostly transporting between, straight points. I know the Tesla itself can detect the car in front of it and adjust braking to keep a safe distance away. Plus, it can detect the car in front of the car in front of them. So if the car in front of the car that it's following brakes quickly, the Tesla will brake. So that's technology that, again, feeds in there for a safety feature.
That's right. I mean, I think there are, I mentioned it in my presentation as well, some of those automated driver assistance features like automatic braking or the lane assist or pedestrian detection, those kinds of things. They have some proven benefits. I want to be a little bit careful about those. There are, I think particularly with Tesla, there are concerns among auto safety regulators that Tesla has sort of oversold what it calls full self-driving, right? That partly because of the way that Tesla has marketed their software, people believe that those driver assistance features are far more capable than they really are. And that's a danger too. If we over rely on these things, if we think a Tesla can drive itself, and it cannot, I just want to be clear, what Tesla calls full self-driving is not full self-driving. There is a risk that we kind of, and we do this all the time with technology, that we begin to believe that it's far more capable than it is, and that in itself is a danger.
I was only going to add that perversely, I think we've benefited from Tesla's reckless deployment of this, because it really has shown what the limitations of it, are, in a way that, the careful experimentation by Waymo hasn't.
I think that's an interesting point. Look, I think we need to ask ourselves whether, I mentioned before that regulators have sort of put in place these guardrails for driverless cars because they don't want companies to test half-baked technology on us, right? That make us guinea pigs, those of us who drive cars or otherwise use roads and sidewalks. And look, people have said that is exactly what Tesla is doing with its the capability that it calls fully self-driving, that is not fully self-driving, that it makes it turns us all, anybody who's on driving or using a road, it makes us all guinea pigs for Tesla's technology. And we did not choose that, right? Nobody asked me if I wanted to share a road with a Tesla that is operating in fully self-driving mode, where the person in the car thinks that means he doesn't have to pay attention. So I'm not sure about I think I'd rather not have Tesla do that as a way to demonstrate the limitations of this technology. It's good enough that we have some of these examples about cars getting confused by, ducks, or again, you hear all these niche cases of driverless cars being confused by teenagers hanging out of a window. And, it all seems like these kind of one-off amusing examples, but the reality is that is our world. Our world is all these like weird things happening all the time that are totally unpredictable. And those are the kind of environments that computers struggle with. And that's exactly the reality of the world as it exists. So it's just a reminder of let's be careful about what we ask this technology to do in the name of human safety, right? In some cases, are we making humans more unsafe by working on this technology that is supposed to be about safety?
Wisely said. Could I just ask you, relating to the rollout of these cars, are you a 5G network evangelist or skeptic, or somewhere in the middle?
I think somewhere in the middle. I think I got frustrated, particularly a couple years ago, that 5G was over marketed in the United States on our phones. That I think, honestly, for almost everyone, we can't tell the difference if our phone is connected to a 5G network or a 4G network. It is just the speed difference is really not perceptible to most people. And the unfortunately, the phone companies and Apple too, they did make a big deal about this, right? Like, we have the best 5G network. It's awesome. It's, will change your life. And it's just not true. And but it has allowed phone companies to sort of charge us more for 5G service, which was, I mean, frankly, that's what they want to do. They need to recoup their costs to build out 5G infrastructure. But, where people talk about 5G being useful, right, is in connecting things that are not me using my phone, but, again, driverless cars talking to one another with sort of far lower latency, a lower speed gap between those cars, or being able to sort of do remote activities, including things like remote surgery, right? Where if the network is faster, then, the moment a surgeon moves her hand with the remotely using it is the scalpel on the other end, kind of making the incision. So, those are some of the purported benefits about 5G technology, and that's real. We're just not going to necessarily see that in our daily lives, at least not right away. So I feel like there was a risk in the kind of marketing hype about 5G as being this amazing thing that's going to change every interaction with your phone or computer, and it's just not true.
Let's go to David Berger and then Mike Emery. David?
Just a note, I like this discussion, so I don't really want to get away from it, but having worked watching how legislative sausage gets made for 25 years, a lot of these things are exactly what you're talking about now, about the hype. There's a lot of over-promising and under-delivering in many areas. One of them is automotive industry and building highways and how much money goes to public transportation and things like that. There are 23 lobbyists for every member of Congress, and they get paid a lot of money because what they do ends up saving auto companies a lot of money. And Tesla was just an example of a really bad CEO because traditional auto companies and truck makers and so on understand the legislative process better. And so it gets down to some basics like that, to change policy and to get allocations for things like public transportation and smart ways of getting people around. Takes a long time because you're battling a lot of vested interests.
No, absolutely true. I want to make clear that the reason change is hard is partly because our government, there's a lot of vested interest in keeping things the way they are, but also change is hard for us, for individuals, right? Even if and this is true in like every aspect of life, even if the things that we do now are terrible, they are at least familiar, right? When we know the problems, I don't want to compare. Making a metaphor to marriage seems dangerous, but I'm going to do it anyway. We may have all these like huge problems with our spouse or in a relationship, but it's also scary to end a marriage or end a relationship, right? So any change in our lives is difficult, and you're right. The difficulty of change is compounded because it requires intervention by government forces, and either because of inertia or because there's a lot of money in keeping things the way they are, that makes change doubly hard when it's not just me making a decision, but we're regulators or governments are making decisions for all of us. So yeah, all of this stuff is incredibly difficult. I don't want to discount the resilience of the status quo.
So it looks like Mike Emery might have our last question. Go ahead, Mike.
Okay, thank you. I've definitely enjoyed this. I think similar to sort of our Second Amendment, haggling and thinking of it as a freedom. Speed in this country is very much a strong issue. I look at the Beltway here, where even though the speed limit is 55, 70 seems to be the low normal. And there was an accident only about, I think, 2 or 3 weeks ago, of 3 teenage girls traveling on a 2-lane road, somewhat windy, uh, and went off the road. And based on investigation by law enforcement, they found that the vehicle was doing just over 100 miles an hour.
Oh.
Yeah, it killed 2 of them. And it's just phenomenal, though. And I'm guilty of it myself, driving on interstates, how we think we can do whatever speed we want in a lot of regards. And I think that's one thing in this country that causes an increase in that fatality rate that we have. Uh, my profession used to be in occupational safety in different areas of that, and where our agency, where I worked, had a lot of vehicles out there, and all by, well, not all, but many of them, law enforcement, federal law enforcement driving them. And one of the big factors we found in investigating those accidents was speed. Uh, so, yeah, I look at that, very strongly from that standpoint.
Yeah, let me bring up, I think it's a great point. And I want to bring up Jesse Singer, who's a journalist, wrote a book last year or the year before called There Are No Accidents, which is sort of a history of accidental death and injury, either in occupational safety, in road accidents, pharmaceutical, overdoses, that kind of thing. And one of her main points is, a lot of the responsibility and blame for accidents, including road accidents, is, and sorry, she does not use the word accident, road crashes, is responsibility on individuals, right? When someone hit and kills someone, we blame that individual. They were driving too fast, they were drunk, they didn't pay attention, something like that. And one of Jesse Singer's points in the book is, we have to design systems, and this is true in occupational safety and in roads and in pharmaceuticals. We have to design systems that doesn't rely on humans being perfect, because we know that humans are not perfect. We have to design systems where even when we make mistakes or are reckless, that it does not put ourselves, or that we try to mitigate the risk to ourselves and others. So I'll just bring up a point, to your point about speed being freedom. So I've talked to Sarah Kaufman, who's a transportation researcher at NYU. One of the things that she has talked to me and others about is speed governors, right? Which we may know from like school buses, right? And some commercial vehicles that basically have speed limitations on how fast the driver can go. And this is also in place in some cities on electric scooters, right? After there were, people crashing into pedestrians on electric scooters. In some cities, if you rent one of these scooters, you can't go more than, I forget, 10 miles an hour or something like that. And one of Sarah Kaufman's point is, maybe instead of putting speed governors on our smallest vehicles like electric scooters, we should also think about speed governors in cars. And I know most Americans will be like, absolutely no way that you will put a speed governor on my privately owned car, expletive. But it does, again, we do accept this in some circumstances, including, commercial vehicles, school buses, electric scooters. In some other countries, there are speed governors on privately owned cars. I think it's a legitimate question. If the speed limit on a residential street is 25 miles an hour, if the speed limit on that 2-lane road was 45 miles an hour, maybe the car shouldn't have been able to go 100 miles an hour, right? Under what circumstances does a car need to go more than 100 miles an hour, right? And again, I know, I mean, I feel resistant to that, right? Because it is an imposition on what I can do with my own car. It feels un-American, right? And I'm not saying that it should happen, but I think it's a reasonable question to ask, right? If we know we've designed this road for people to go 25 miles an hour, is it a good idea that it relies on us going 25 miles an hour, that on me making that good choice to follow the rules? Maybe instead we should just take that choice out of people's hands. Again, I know people will scream about this, and I feel resistant to it too, but I do think it is worth thinking about. Again, in the mode of, there are things we have accepted as normal, and maybe we should just start to rethink. Okay, but this is how it is, and this is how it has been. But is it good? Should we think about doing something else?
And I suppose cars were made so they couldn't go any faster than 55 or 60, so that it wouldn't even be the driver's choice.
Right. And I think
governor or not.
It's exactly right. I think Sarah Kaufman's point is, because we have now we have technology that can communicate between the car and the road surface. A car, again, they do this in electric scooters. An electric scooter can be designed so it knows, okay, this is the person riding the scooter is entering a central business district where there's a lot of congestion. Now the scooter can only go 10 miles an hour. That is the maximum speed limit, right? We have that ability through technology now to just put a speed limit on cars automatically when they go certain places. And again, they do this in some countries, and we do this in some types of vehicles in the United States. Again, I'm not saying this is what we should do, but I do think it's part of this mentality of trying to think different about what has been normal about moving around people and goods, and which we can now see has both benefits and profound downsides.
Well,
It
related to
be
this,
like on a highway.
Hold on a second, please. Diana, do you want to make a last
Just
comment?
one final thought. That
and
when
then
I'm
we'll
on the
be
highway,
wrapping things up. Yeah.
when I'm on the highway, it always seems like no matter how fast you go, there's always somebody else who wants to go faster, and probably many people who do. And that's my last thought. So thank you.
And I think I can't help the comment, Shira, that speed governors is a lot less expensive than what we really need to do was to re-engineer the roads, not for speed.
Right. And again, they have done that in many countries, right? And in some parts of the United States too. You just, there is real power in, instead of making a road long, fast, there are proven ways of making people slow down, intuitively slow down. You make the road a little curvy, you put in a traffic roundabout, a traffic circle. When people feel like hemmed in by trees, they tend to drive slowly because it feels less safe to drive fast. So there are interventions that are not speed governors that are just about making people feel less safe driving quickly.
And to switch to a more pleasant topic, I wanted to thank you so much, Shira, for coming and speaking to us today. And I would like to offer share
oh, nice.
A handsome pie mug. And hopefully, as I mentioned in our emails, when we are visiting our daughter who lives in Long Island City in February, maybe we can figure a place that's midway between where you are and where they are when we are there, where I could ride a city bike over and deliver this handsome pie mug.
That sounds good. We will each ride a bicycle to where we're going.
Do you use City Bike?
I don't use City Bike very much. I have my own bicycle, and City Bike is, as you will discover, not cheap. But I actually did just get a City Bike is owned by Lyft. And I did just get a Lyft, like a membership that entitles me to free City Bike rides. So I think I'll be riding City Bike more.
Terrific. Roy, President Roy, do you have any final words for us today?
No, I want to thank Sheila for this great presentation today. It was really outstanding. A lot of good points made and a lot of good discussion by everybody.
Yeah, thank you all. It was a really great discussion. I really appreciate your thoughtful questions and comments.
Thank you.
Bye,
So
everybody.
we will look forward to aspects of this coming out in your I Am a Tech Friend column.
Yes, yes. I will be writing more about this. This is something I'm trying to turn into the professional focus. So stay tuned.
All right. Thanks so much.
I didn't do a drawing.
So, folks, we will send around the really rich chat from this meeting. Oh my God.
Thank you, everybody, for attending.
Well, this is great. I'm waving my hand, but my hand raise isn't going up. So I think this Zoom account, I must have not enabled that.
I thought I tried to enable it and it still doesn't work.
Does this one? Let's see. No.
I'll have to check those options again. I don't know. Maybe I set them and then they go away, but I don't know.
Exactly.
Okay, good choice of speaker. Great presentation.
Yeah. Very, very, very good. All right.
right.
Shall I end the meeting, Roy?
Yep, might as well.